Everyone, it's rainy but we have a very warm, beautiful book to talk about. And look at the cover, Alex. I heard that you chose the cover.
Of course.
I
This
think
is
that was our runner-up, but actually I think it's better than the original. So.
this is beautiful. That's wonderful. So first want to start with congratulations to Ithamar Theodore for his excellent new book on the Bhagavad-gita. Can we give a please round of applause? Get warmed up. So this panel of reviewers is star-studded panel. We don't need to really say too much. Everyone knows these scholars. And we'll go in the order they are listed in the program. So it'll be easier for those who are incoming attendees. So the first one, my name is Veena Howard. I teach at California State University, Fresno. The first will be Jonathan Edelman, International Society for Science and Religion. Nikky Singh, a very eminent scholar of Sikhism, Professor Kobe College. Dr. Graham Schweig, Christopher Newport University, very eminent scholar of Bhagavatam, right? And all kind of things. And Stephanie Corigliano, I always mess it up, Corigliano, lecturer Cal Poly Humboldt. Yes. And Professor Aleksandar Uskokov. Can we say it one more time? Uskokov. Okay. He's a senior lecturer and associate research scholar, Yale University, studies Vedanta, and Advaita Sri Vaishnava Gaudiya. So please join me in welcoming all our eminent reviewers, and then we'll be followed by remarks from Ithamar Theodore, and then we'll have a discussion. So please welcome all of us. So Dr. Jonathan, do you want to speak from here or here?
What do you prefer?
Come here.
Start.
Stand up, stretch.
Yeah, actually, it might be good to
Then everybody can see.
stand this time of day.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Ithamar, for this wonderful book, and to DANAM for this opportunity to respond to it. I do have a paper here, which I'm going to kind of use as a basis for my discussion of the book. This is a culmination, clearly, Itamar's many years of work on this. I was really pleased to see when I saw Cambridge University had published this, and the title, The Philosophy of the Bhagavad-gita, quite apart from your name being attached to it, which was a draw to read it anyway. When I saw that, I was immediately drawn to it. Cambridge University, taking very seriously the philosophy of the Bhagavad-gita. I was sold. I wanted to read it right then. So congratulations on this book. And then chapter 8, which you sent me to focus on, was right in my wheelhouse as well. So I appreciate that you selected such a good portion for me to focus on. And that's really what my comments are here about this. I've had a number of discussions that very recent, as recent as last night, that have influenced the way I have read this book. I thought I would just kind of go over some of the points that you make at the very beginning, just to kind of see that we're all on the same page, and then to kind of give the basis for my questions and comments, and it may be a couple of critical and a best way positive comments as well. So my understanding is that you start off by setting up a kind of purvapaksha that seemed to be coming from Sylvester Herbert's recent book on Vaishnavism, that the theological attributes of God, such as omni qualities, must be conjointly consistent. That's my reading of this chapter, taking on that view. You quote Das Gupta saying that theological concepts of pantheism, deism, and theism cannot be brought together under one creed, and he's kind of criticizing the Bhagavad-gita for seeming to kind of be a warehouse of different theological concepts, but at the same time saying that doesn't really work. So I'm taking these two as the Purva-paksha, the opponent that you're trying to take on in this chapter, and that you immediately come into personalism as an interpretive tool for the Gita, quoting Jan Olaf Bengtsson. I like this introduction because it's all Oxford people, right? These are all our friends that we kind of went through the system, the Oxford system together with, and now it's being published by Cambridge. So it's kind of like an Oxford reading of the Gita published at Cambridge. I'm not sure that the publisher was aware how heavily influenced that introduction, and I think a lot of the book is by a lot of people that we all studied with at the Hindu Studies Center and the different colleges and other centers, philological and theological, philosophical centers at Oxford. So that was fun to read, but this seems to be the kind of the essence of what you want to communicate, that we should talk about this concept of personalism, and it responds to the conjointly consistent attributes argument. So what does this personalism mean? It seems like what you're saying is it's a personalism because it is a conversation between two people. There we got two people, Krishna and Arjuna, who are talking, and therefore it's a personalistic argument. So let me just stop there with maybe a little bit of a criticism or a question. The logic of this argument seems a bit, here's what my struggle with it, because it seems like all books are a conversation. How does it between two people? How is the Bhagavad-gita different than any text which is explicitly dialogical? As I think that period of writing, we're talking about a little bit BC, 500 or so BC. A lot of the texts are dialogical. The Upanishads are conversations. A lot of the Vedas is conversational. Plato is writing his dialogues. And then people do shift into, like with Aristotle, a kind of more just like lecture note type of writing. But it's still very much a conversation between Aristotle and Plato. And then the Vedantic discourse shifts from the theological Upanishads into sort of the more propositional philosophical, theological approach of the Vedanta. But it's still very much a conversational text. It's still somebody talking to and about ancient texts. So that's my question first, is like, how do we distinguish personalism / conversation between two people, making the Gita unique from all texts? Okay, so then you say, and that because of it being a conversation, the very notions of divinity can be categorized systematically. So here I'm wondering how you go back to Silvestre and Herbert's Purva-paksha that you set it up with, which seems to be, your criticism seems to be that, no, we should not be expecting in the Gita this conjointly consistent concept of God's attributes, because it's not that kind of book. It's not a philosophical treatise in the sense of one single doctrine, here it is, boom, 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 it's laid out. It's more of this conversation that develops between these two people, but it's also systematically organized. So I guess what you're saying is that it is the kind of conversation which has a systematic structure to it. It's a systematic discussion. It's not a conversation that just kind of goes all over the place, but there's maybe an intentionality behind it that is moving from one point to another. I hope I'm understanding you correctly. Because you do say very next, it's the philosophy of the Gita is not as arguing from a certain point of view. It's arguing from this gradual process because it is a transformative text. The language is meant to go deeper and higher. So you use these metaphors of going deeper and higher, so it's kind of going up and down. And then eventually you call this a model. So this is maybe the second point I want to make, is that this is a philosophy of the Gita, but I think really it's your hermeneutical perspective on the Gita, or your articulation of this is how we should read the Gita. And I think there's a slight difference. How much time am I doing on time? 4 minutes. There's a slight difference here. The philosophy of the Gita. I mean, I'm not saying it should be a different title. I like the title, but it's the kind of philosophy that is laying out certain hermeneutical principles of interpretation. Here's the kind of book it is, and here's how we should read it because of these principles. So you call it a model, but I really think this is more of a hermeneutical model, a hermeneutical perspective, or a hermeneutics of the Gita. So that leads then to what you leap into the next portion of the chapter, which is the storied house analogy. And to me, again, this is a kind of very hermeneutical point. Your argument here seems to be of one concept or another appeals to someone based on their, quote, state of mind. The stories, first, second, third, are lower to higher God concepts, and that each of these stories are observable in the Gita. That seems to be your argument. So this is not in the Gita, as far as I know. This is not an analogy or metaphor anywhere found in the Gita. It's not even something that really seems to be, I was trying to think, is this something more broadly in Indian philosophy? I couldn't really locate it, so I was walking around the city of Boston, thinking about looking at the buildings, trying to figure out how this analogy can fit with the Gita, and here's how I do think it works. Here's what I like about it, okay? Because we talked about this. Does this really work? I think if it is true that the Gita is articulating these different God concepts in order to appeal to people of different natures and dispositions and desires, then it does make sense, because when you're walking around the city, what do you see? You see the ground floor. You can look into the windows, you can see what's going on, the door, maybe there's somebody sitting in you can see and you can decide, I do want to go in there or I don't. Once you get into the house, then okay, this is a cafe or whatever, and then you can go up, and the second floor might be very different, right? There is a logic to that yeah, houses have different stories and they are very different, and the reason you go in one house or another is because it's appealing to you at some level. So I think it works in that sense, and that brings me back to the original, kind of point here, that this seems much more like a hermeneutical perspective that's very much rooted in your experience and conversations with people about the Gita in our community. And I like this, that the book that I'm writing right now that's done, I distinguish between how I argue that basically the way that we learn is we encounter a kind of what I'm calling an immediate community. Maybe this is something that resonates with you. How do we learn about ancient thought? It's from particular people that introduce it to us. And that immediate community introduces us to a more distant community, right? We learn, last night we were, for example, learning about how Clooney learned Indian philosophy from people in Chicago, but that introduced him to all these more ancient texts, but that also happened to us. So is this really kind of the implied argument of your book, is that I'm trying to spell out all the people, all the places, and all of the ideas that have informed me and have formed my particular hermeneutical perspective, and this is how I've used it to make sense of the Gita. Once I started to think about the book like that, it started to make a lot more sense. It sunk in. The arguments that you're making began to sink in much more strongly. So I'm curious if you think I'm reading you correctly or not. All right, thank you very much.
Yes, I'll go there too. Congratulations, Itamar. It's really wonderful. And I'm really glad I'm part of the celebration. So very, very happy and welcome from Israel at this time, coming all the way. It's admirable. Thank you very much. So I'm not a scholar of the Hindu tradition, but it is, what you've produced here is a wonderful study of the Gita. It's interesting, illuminating, and very accessible. It has really renewed my own interest in the study of the Gita, which is such a critical text for us scholars of South Asian religions. My research focuses on Sikh scripture, so turning to your work has provided me with new insights. For instance, in the Japji, the opening hymn of the Guru Granth Sahib, there are 5 spiritual stages, which are kind of quintessential of Sikh philosophy. And the first realm is that of Dharma. So you start out with Dharma, you go into the realm of Gyan, knowledge comes later. Then the third realm, which has been translated in various ways and understood in various ways, is Saram, which to me is aesthetics. And then you move on to the realm of Karma, which scholars, the exegetes in the past understood as grace of God or something like that. But for me, it's always been action. So it's very interesting that Dharma, Jnana, aesthetics, Karma, action, and then you are into the realm of truth. But anyway, it's given me insights to go back and rethink this basic framework. So I was in charge of chapter 2, and there Dharma is the basic framework. In fact, it's of your study. We all know the word Dharma from the root third, to sustain at the individual, social, political, and at the cosmic levels. And the Bhagavad-gita begins with Dharma. That's the primary question. It is Arjuna's crisis, which is explicitly a crisis of Dharma. And as you argue, it is Vedic Varna Ashram Dharma which serves as a unitary framework for the entire text. So what comes through this framework of Dharma are all the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad-gita. The metaphysics, the ethics, the Sankhya philosophy, the psychology, all of them you bring under through this strand, through this very important strand. And the 3 yogas, karma, jnana, and bhakti, Sankhya coming together. But not only the Gita, I also see there is coming here the Vedic tradition, the yogic, the Upanishadic worldviews, these are conjoined. So you indeed make a strong case that Dharma is not only central but constitutive of the Gita. And I liked your Francis Clooney reference, which makes the case for bypassing the division between theology and philosophy. So in a way, those are combined, and that comes out very well. So you demonstrate, and that was what you just mentioned, the 3-story house. That's kind of your basic framework, the model, the metaphor on which how everything is unified, the ethics, metaphysics, and psychology of the Gita into a coherent philosophical and theological structure. So the 3 levels of the house, as I read in the chapter 2, are the first one is the human, the second is the spiritual, and the third is moksha or liberation. So, and these 3 levels have their different ontologies, their different ethics, their different goals. And in the human one, that's the ontological human being, Dharma is utilitarian. You gain honor or dishonor. It's the ethics of prosperity, happy, healthy living in the world of Dharma, performing Vedic sacrifices. Number 2, the second level, the second tier of the house, is the life of yoga. And here it's the spiritualistic point of view of Dharma. Dharma performed for its own sake. This is an ethics not of prosperity, but of equanimity. And what comes to mind is that beautiful analogy from the Bhagavad-gita, the mind sitting there, mind in a windless night, the lamp, the flame, not flickering, not going up and down, not being kind of a yo-yo. That perfect serenity and equanimity. So that image comes through here, the windless night. And the third one is liberation, Dharma performed for the sake of Brahman. So in this process, from samsara to moksha, what is used? And there you say it is the ladder. And the ladder is karma yoga, actionless action. Action plus yoga. Action and yoga renunciation. So that's how you kind of reconcile the two, actions and renunciation. And here I think, well, the lotus image is just perfect, which Lord Krishna himself provides. Being in the world, being in the murkiness of the world, right here, and yet being liberated, staying afloat, not being sinking or diving into its murkiness. So that kind of both renouncing the fruits of action. So you're acting, but the renunciation involves the fruits of action, and you bring it out very well. So within this architecture, Dharma is the duty-bound social principle derived from the one ashram system. As such, it's the momentum that unifies the entire text across all various metaphysical levels. And here is the Mara, I want to quote you, I really like that. Dharma should not be thought of as something static, but as a balance that is constantly being struck. And I think in your work you echo Zehner and Klaus Klostermaier and how the Gita is a unitary, cohesive text, and your study highlights the Gita as a rich, multi-layered, unified text. So it's really, really a great study. I do have a few questions, and I wonder, here's the Bhagavad-gita, we've known it, it has all these, so many modes and thoughts and psychologies around. Is it correct to impose a structure on it? So that's one of my questions. Are we closing off the opening of the text, the openness of the text? Number two, I also am a little curious about your personal lens. What's your methodology? Where are you coming from? 3, I feel your study elicits some focus on the body, because the prelude to the chapter is really Lord Krishna saying how, oh, it doesn't matter, Arjuna, what you do, the body, it's just garments that you put on today and so forth. So I think in that human level or somewhere, we need to kind of give it some thought. And the fourth was, you talk about the metaphysics, you talk about the ethics, you talk about the psychology of the Gita, but aesthetics is missing. And I find the Bhagavad-gita the most beautiful literary text. And I wish some of those analogies, whether of the lamp, whether of the lotus, whether, the tortoise kind of withdrawing, some of those things were brought up in a more flourishing way. And my final question is, you model it on the Varna Ashram Dharma, that primal Vedic sacrifice from the Rig Veda, where the cosmic person, the Purusha, sacrifices, and as he disembers or she disembers, it disembers, the world comes to be, the Brahmins from the mouth, the Kshatriyas from the arms, the Vaishyas from the thighs, and the Shudras. That is maintained constantly, the Varnashram Dharma. But in chapter 9, 32, that is challenged by Lord Krishna himself. And I do like that verse. I don't know much Sanskrit. I did study it for 2 years at time. Didn't. But that Striyo Vaishyas Tatha Shudram Tepi Yanti Param Gatam. So what do we do? Here women and the low caste and so forth, they break away from those caste systems. So that's it. These are my 5 little questions, but I did enjoy that chapter. And I thank you for giving me this assignment, Veena. I was trying to get out of
Okay, thank you, DANAM organizers, and Itamar for your book. Congratulations, and thank you for inviting me to be here on the panel. My chapter is the chapter 3 on rebirth, and So Itmar Theodore's chapter on rebirth offers a comprehensive philosophical exposition of how the Gita conceptualizes the soul's cyclical existence within samsara, and how this concept grounds the text's larger ethical, ontological, and yogic frameworks. Throughout this chapter, Theodore consistently emphasizes that rebirth is not a peripheral doctrine, but the structural second story upon which much of the Gita's worldview rests. Theodore succinctly explains the three-story metaphor developed in his earlier works and referenced in these other papers. In his words, I just quote here, that the lower level, quote, is the humanistic and comprises the human life in this world. So that would be first story. The second level is spiritualistic and comprises an intermediate story whereby one relinquishes worldly life and seeks the state of liberation, so detachment practices. And the third story represents full absorption into the liberated state. So this chapter 3 positions the discussion of rebirth in the third chapter as, so that the rebirth is the second story, so focused on this process of detachment. Theodore positions this as, quote, so important that it is not possible to understand the Gita without understanding this concept, end quote. The chapter is divided into 4 sections. The first is looking at samsara from above, and it depicts the broad cyclical view of time in which, quote, living beings helplessly undergo rebirth and redeath again and again, coming into being and then dissolving helplessly, end quote. Thus, the chapter opens by framing rebirth not merely as a metaphysical claim, but as a perspective, a way of seeing human life from above. Theodore highlights how the Gita embeds individual human experience within the vast cyclical cosmological rhythms, most dramatically illustrated through Brahma's cosmic days and nights of chapter 8. This cosmology situates every living being within a cosmic drama of manifestation and dissolution, a backdrop that reinforces the futility of attachment to transient forms. This aerial view functions ethically once one grasps the repetitive nature of cosmic and individual rebirth. Moral action becomes disentangled from short-term gains. The second section is ontological aspects, the nature of the soul, and it turns to several early Upanishads and Puranic narratives to unpack the origin of the Gita's understanding of Atman, or soul. It engages the Bhagavad-gita on the question of what reincarnates, and what is moksha, or the promise of liberation. The Gita's description, especially in the early verses of chapter 2, echoes but significantly elaborates upon classical statements on the Atman's immortality and non-agency. The soul is unborn, quote, unborn, eternal, unending, and primeval. This is from Bhagavad-gita 2:20. It neither kills nor can be killed. Theodore notes connections to Sankhya philosophy, explaining that the Gita emphasizes that death is, quote, that is not non-being, asat, but only a change in appearance, because nothing that truly is, or sat, can vanish into non-being, end quote. While consistent with the text and philosophical teachings, this remains a very challenging teaching within the Gita, pointing towards the almost futility of our most heartfelt connections. Consistent with Theodore's analysis of rebirth as part of the second story that occurs when one relinquishes worldly life, this point is philosophically logical. Dharmic action, seen in this lens as an ethical ladder, requires this detachment, according to the Gita. But the requirement of detachment nonetheless presents a foundational problem for those enmeshed in family life or whose work centers on perhaps social justice issues. That's maybe one of my ongoing research and study problems of this charge for detachment as a constant question. Then the third section is transmigration and rebirth. The third section of this chapter 3. It discusses the karmic action that informs rebirth with particular attention to the individual's dying thought or desire. This chapter as a whole, and this section in particular, has implications for teaching or thinking deeply about the Hindu worldview on death by explaining how the Gita conceptualizes the mechanism of rebirth. The mind, or manas, as part of the subtle body, carries the soul into the next body, complete with latent impressions, desires, and mental dispositions that shape the form of the next body. The verse Bhagavad-gita 8:6, quote, "Whatever state of being one remembers at the final moment, to that he will go," end quote, serves as the key point. This teaching explains the practical consequences of bhakti. Habits create who we are, in life and in the next, in this life and the next. A habit of bhakti creates a kind of muscle memory that draws the mind and consequently the soul towards God and the possibility of a more favorable rebirth or even liberation. This section also called to mind for me in reading a short poem by Tulsidas, which simultaneously valorizes all bhakti practice and at the same time points towards an almost haphazard aspect of God's play. I'll include the short poem here because it nods towards the iconoclastic forms of bhakti that emerge out of the epic traditions and the unpredictable ways of divine and human expression. These are Tulsi's words and the translation. A blind, mean-minded, dull-witted, withered up, old Muslim on the road got knocked down by a son of a pig. This is the opening of the poem. As he fell, fear filled his heart. Oh God, unclean, unclean, an unclean thing has killed me, he moaned. As he groaned and fell into the jaws of death, Tulsi says, his sorrows vanished, and he went straight away to the land of the Lord of all worlds. As everyone knows, it is because the power of the name. That very name of God is what people say with love, so how can they say its grandeur places it where it's impossible to go? Theodore's analysis, that's the end of the poem. Theodore's analysis somewhat corresponds to this unusual poem by reflecting upon Arjuna's predicament. Krishna is commanding him to fight, to be active within the world, so that his task of remembering God differs from ascetic meditation or contemplation, and is instead carried out in the midst of on the cosmic battlefield. Further, a key argument made in the introduction, summary, and body of this chapter is that bhakti requires rebirth to avoid collapsing into mere emotionalism. These are Theodore's words. So I'm curious for a bit more about how the doctrine of rebirth safeguards bhakti from sentimentality. Is bhakti purely functional? Does intention matter? As in the poem of Tulsi, where Tulsi is arguing that intention doesn't matter. It only requires saying the name. Disposition doesn't matter. Okay, still within this section, Theodore turns to the question of how to conceive of that which transmigrates. Rendering an exegetical analysis of Bhagavad-gita 15:7-11, he notes that the physical form of rebirth echoes the subtle form of the previous birth, both of which are fragments of Krishna's omnipresent form. In the fourth and final section of this chapter, the detached yogic view, body-self relations, delves into the Gita's distinctive body-self dualism, which grounds the practice of detached action. The Gita frequently asserts that the self does not act at all. That's chapter 13:29. And that all actions belong to nature, prakriti, driven by the gunas rather than the soul. This theme culminates in several intertwined claims. The body is described as a yantra or machine here, translated as machine, upon which the soul is mounted. Ego, ahamkara, is the primary bridge linking the soul to prakriti and is thus responsible for the illusion of agency. The dissolution of the ego in the soul, residing happily, free from karmic accumulation, results in this residing. Thus, rebirth is not merely an external cosmological doctrine. It is internalized as psychological and contemplative practice, enabling the yogi to perceive the self as distinct from the constantly shifting movements of prakriti. And a few final comments. Theodore's chapter demonstrates that rebirth in the Bhagavad-gita is not just another metaphysical proposition, but is the conceptual glue that binds the text's ethics, epistemology, psychology, and soteriology. By elaborating rebirth across 4 interlocking themes, the cosmic cycles, the soul's eternal nature, the mechanisms of mental-driven transmigration, and the yogic disentangling of soul-body dualism and agency, the chapter clarifies why rebirth is indispensable to the Gita's philosophical architecture. Through this thematic lens, rebirth becomes both the backdrop and the engine of spiritual transformation, underscoring the Gita's core invitation and challenge to act with full engagement in the world while simultaneously cultivating a consciousness that transcends it. And as a final point, this book on the whole takes on the challenging practice of presenting a non-sectarian philosophical basis for understanding and learning from the Bhagavad-gita. I particularly appreciate, and this is leaving my chapter 3 and harkening to chapter 1, how the project is framed in the chapter 1 by pointing to the work of Ram Prasad Chakravarti and the practices of constructive theology in the Christian studies of religion. Theodore also cites Julius Lipner's use of the term theological Indologist to evoke a tension present in the ostensibly objective-subjective study of philosophical and faith traditions. And we heard about this somewhat last night in the talk by Francis Clooney. These modes of study, thinking, and practice that are fundamentally aimed at reshaping the mind and potentially society are somewhat at odds with a purely objective approach. In my view, this rich positioning of the book points towards an even broader horizons of constructive thought and interreligious, interspiritual dialogues. If time permits, I'd love to hear a bit more about how you envision and understand this project as constructive or perhaps as a kind of theological indologist. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, well, good morning. Happy to be invited to this panel. And my colleagues previously speaking have said a lot, so I won't repeat some of the things that they nicely summarized and appreciated about Itamar's work. So encountering Itamar's work, well, first of all, let me just say that there can never be enough written about the Bhagavad-gita. Okay, this is a text that keeps on giving. So, you know, when I saw Itamar's book and his previous work on the Bhagavad-gita, I said, yeah, there he goes. Yeah, there's more to say. There's more to say. There's more to say, and I am sure that Itamar will be writing several other books after this on the Bhagavad-gita because it's a text that keeps on giving. Okay, so my assignment that Veena so graciously and slightly obnoxiously assigned me, is it tomorrow? Yeah. So is it tomorrow? Because when I finally got the book a few days ago, I said, okay, my assignment, I'm trying to be a good student, away from being the professorial sort of mode of doing things. So I said, they gave me the assignment of the Bhakti chapter. I'm going to read the Bhakti chapter. So I'm reading it along. I'm saying, wait a minute, I can't just, who looks at a film in the middle, starts in the middle? I mean, so I had to go back and found myself reading through much of the book, and then I realized I've been neglecting the chapter to which I had been assigned. So my thoughts are scattered like crazy, and I'm just going to give you my sort of random thoughts here. Well, first of all, as someone who has also encountered the Bhagavad-gita, teaching it for 35 years in the classroom, I've gone through various phases of how do you present the Gita, and usually it's in just a week or two, along with everything else that you have to present. I do have a course that focuses primarily on the Bhagavad-gita, so this is the time I can really dive in and so on. So I was, pleasantly surprised how much Itamar is giving the Gita, a kind of structure as a way of perhaps entering into the Gita. So I was looking at it as maybe this is perhaps a fresh way for me to, present the Bhagavad-gita differently than the way I've been doing it. But I had always, when translating the Bhagavad-gita, way back in the day for HarperCollins, it came out in 2007, I came to, through the whole process of translating, every publisher says, when will you be finished with the translation? And I said, I've been reading the Gita for decades. Just give me a year and a half, I obnoxiously said. And a year and a half went by, and 2 years went by, and 3 years went by. I found myself absolutely stunned by all that I was discovering, and all that was revealing the nuance of the text. And I came to the conclusion back then that the text is very fluid and very woven in different strands of thought and thinking. And this is one of the things I admired with what Itamar was doing, is he was trying to bring all of these subtle weaves and complexities, the warp and the woof of the Gita together, moving entirely away from the typical sort of traditional, view of the Gita. The first 6 chapters are karma, the second 6 chapters are bhakti, and the last 6 chapters are jnana. He completely moves away from that, which was refreshing and good. So my chapter is, on bhakti, and of course, I was happy to see how he sort of navigated through this kind of bhakti supported by Dharma first, and then Dharma supported by yoga second, Dharma supported by jnana, bhakti supported by Dharma, backwards here. And bhakti supported by yoga, bhakti supported by jnana, and then bhakti unsupported by anything except by itself. Now, when I first started reading this, am I messing up the electronics here? So when I was reading about this, I was thinking, well, what happened to karma? So then I had to go back to the beginning of the book, where Itamar clearly states that karma and dharma are clearly interrelated, and he discusses this at length, and I won't go into details. But clearly, he includes dharma in that, karma in the discussion of dharma. Now, he says here, and I quote, the following section highlights the theme of devotion supported by Dharma, which serves as the unifying thread of the entire Bhagavad-gita. So that was a sweeping, just almost knocked me off my feet. And then I was thinking how the very first word of the Bhagavad-gita is Dharma. The very first word, Dharma kshetre, kurukshetre, samabhika, yugatsava, etc. And then I was thinking, well, what about what is known well, I think Ramanuja called it the Charama Shloka, 1866, where all forms of Dharma are to be, relinquished. So then I'm getting really confused, because here Itamar says it's supported throughout the unifying thread of the whole Gita. And I was thinking, well, then what do we do with that, sort of climactic message of the Gita? Well, then I got further confused a little bit when Itamar says here, I quote, "This section well exemplifies how dharmic duty is gradually sublimated and ultimately turns into devotional service unto the Supreme Person." So sublimation is the process of taking something very undesirable an unacceptable society to make it acceptable and compatible. It's a psychological term that Freud came up with. So I'm wondering, how in the world is this sublimation? But then I'm thinking in terms of 1866, how one is to relinquish all forms of Dharma, so there's the sublimation. So ultimately, Dharma is kind of not that great a thing in the ultimate sense. So I've had this back and forth sort of love-hate relationship with your presentation about this, because I don't know whether Dharma is the whole thing or whether ultimately it's to build up the drama of the love coming from the divine to humans. Okay, so, but I'm reading through and I'm really pleasantly informed about the relationship of bhakti to Dharma, the relationship of bhakti to yoga, and the relationship of bhakti to jnana. One of the things, though, that is sort of, I questioned a little bit, is referring to the Ashtanga yoga as a ladder. It's nowhere in the Yoga Sutra as a ladder. These are limbs. Now, I agree that my legs are lower limbs, and my arms are a higher limb, and my head is probably the highest limb. But I can't really do without the lower limbs. And as much as Jonathan's tour around Boston was very nice, the fact is, I went to the 3rd floor in my hotel and found it really boring and went back down to the 1st floor. And I'm glad whatever you were finding, Jonathan was
cool places.
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay. I clearly wasn't in the same building that Jonathan was in. So I'm not sure that each particular floor is necessarily better than the other, although you seem to be imputing some kind of greater value, okay, in this kind of, as you put it, hierarchy. But in the yoga system, limbs mean they're all essential. They're all, you cannot do without the limbs. And so the word sopana, I think is the word for ladder, or
That's right.
isn't it? Sopana,
Yes.
right? And that nowhere appears in the Yoga Sutra, and for that matter, not in the Gita. But Itamar, you supply this idea of a ladder. And again, I'm trying to work with the metaphor because clearly ladders are used to climb up to a particular place, and then sometimes you just kick away the ladder because you don't need it anymore. But then it sounds like you, in your model, you still need the ladder. So I think in a way, limbs works maybe a little better in the way that Patanjali talks about it. Perhaps, okay. Then of course, I was surprised that after Itamar beautifully explains how bhakti in and of itself is so valuable in his last part of unsupported, right, by anything, pure devotion. Then I was surprised to come across an added section, dramatic elements in the Bhagavad-gita. Now, what does that have to do with bhakti? Okay. Now, of course, you're quoting Zehner quite liberally throughout the work. Well, one of the things that has bugged me about Zehner, I do appreciate his translation a lot. Of course, mine's a little better. But anyway, so, no, I'm just mumbling here. I tend to mumble. Yeah. But Zehner says on the first page of chapter 11, so this is what I appreciated about your section, but I'll say in a second. Zehner says on the very opening line of the first introductory paragraph of chapter 11 in his book, that this is the climactic message of the whole Gita. And I cannot tell you how I've had bad dreams about this, because it is hardly, it's extremely dramatic, but it is hardly the climactic message of the Gita. Now, perhaps, of course, he was drawing from the Sri Ramanuja tradition, and perhaps that is more emphasized. I'm not able to say, but what I was really surprised here is how Itamar brings in Bharata's dramaturgical theory and applies the different bhavas, the different feelings that are exhibited in the 11th chapter. I was hoping you were going to go further. Why not the whole Gita? There are all kinds of emotions that are going back and forth. So I didn't expect this little add-on here, and yet, but then you whetted my appetite, and I said, what about the rest of the Gita? I mean, there are some very dramatic points in the rest of the Gita, you know. So anyway, so this book has delighted me in so many ways and agitated the hell out of me at the same time, and wanting to see things pursued more and to see where it could go. And I ended up by saying, you know what? I'm going to teach this stuff in the classroom and see how well it works. Thank you very much.
So I've been assigned chapter 6 for 4 through 6. I'll try to give a little more general remarks and touch on some elements in the 3 chapters. So let me begin by commending Itamar for writing a very interesting book on the Bhagavad-gita. Itamar has been at the helm of Gita scholarship for several decades. And my first thought of a new book on the Gita was one of caution. What is by now left unsaid, what questions have not been yet raised about such a text of perennial interest, but I was happy to see and to report now that this is indeed a new reading of Krishna's song, one that very much deserves to be read by beginners and experts alike. And now, Itamar's point is to read the Gita philosophically, not however as a historian of philosophy might read it, but rather as someone who seeks to engage the text as a legitimate participant in contemporary philosophical discourse, i.e. how philosophers today might read Aristotle or Aquinas by letting them speak to contemporary philosophical concerns, even if there isn't any more direct line between the problems they were involved with and the questions that modern philosophers ask. Itamar's original thesis is that the Bhagavad-gita may be read through the lens of 2 ideas. That of a 3-story structure in ontological terms, and that of a ladder that connects the 3 stories in soteriological terms. The inspiration for the first seems to come from Christian Coseru, who is a modern scholar of Indian philosophy, but is in fact derivative of, and as far as I can see, best explained in terms of Ludwig Wittgenstein's forms of life and language games. Let me briefly tell you how. There is a level on which the Bhagavad-gita talks by assuming the human natural and social condition is given, i.e. a level on which an ontological description obtains and with it associated ethical practices. In Itamar's account, expressed by the Sankhya theory of guna on the one hand, and the Mimamsa and related accounts of Dharma on the other. There is a second story of spiritual practices that are supplementary or alternative to one another. It is the discourse of yoga in its numerous forms. And then there is the story of attainment, liberation, moksha, on which different sorts of questions become pertinent, such as what descriptions are most appropriate to the attainment. Are they dualistic, non-dualistic? Is it intellectual or emotional, etc.? So the 3 are 3 separate stories, as Itamar puts it, or 3 language games, as we may say following Wittgenstein. And understanding what story any section of the Gita belongs to is paramount for its interpretation. Where this scheme departs from Wittgenstein is in its ethical ladder that Itamar proposes, one that links the 3 stories, which is mostly clearly inspired by the theology of Keith Ward. What the Gita saving stories means, in the sense in which Itamar understands this, is well illustrated in the case of Sankhya, and specifically in its being the ontological ground of the Gita's first story, the humanistic. In chapter 5, Itamar makes the very interesting analysis of the guna theory of the Bhagavad-gita. Guna is, of course, the term of art in classical Sankhya, the word itself meaning quality, but in Sankhya really having the sense of, as Itamar rightly shows following the time-honored argument of Surendranath Dasgupta, a thread in the somewhat literal sense. In this light, gunas are better seen as substances and qualities. Key here, I think, is the pair that derives from ritual causality, i.e. pradhana as the primary constituents of any ritual and guna as subordinate element, not necessarily a quality. That Sankhya arguably inherits from Mimamsa. It is the gunas in their own turn as substances that become the support or units of various qualities, that is their ontology. But then the discourse of the three gunas is obviously an ethical connotation in that through the qualities, human traits, and modes of behavior they embody, as well as through their determination of every element of human existence, from food to speech to interpersonal relations, in which manner they pave existential paths for all embodied entities, either facilitating rise to the second story of the Gita or leading elsewhere. Itamar also notes an epistemological function of the gunas that should be relatively transparent, i.e. that sattva is associated with discernment and mystical intuition, etc. So the compounded value of Itamar's analysis is that the guna theory, as presented in the Bhagavad-gita, is a global theory, i.e. a theory of everything, but specifically insofar as it is a tool for understanding as well as interpreting the human condition. This is what is being seen as the first story of the means. In any case, what Itamar manages here is to make quite a novel account, one that is interesting to read, for what others have seen as tiresome. It probably includes most of us here who have read the Gita and related Sankhya texts with their penchant for pedantic classification many times. There is a freshness of thought here that is much appreciated, and I think Itamar's global account comes in a particularly good light here, because it helps us appreciate how the Gita isn't a hopelessly unsystematic and mutually inconsistent grab bag for all that was philosophically in vogue in the subcontinent around the turn of the millennium. In other words, the originality of Itamar's account is that we need to understand the specific level on which a language game in the Gita takes place by asking the following questions. Is this a description of the human condition? Does it concern practice? Is it a description of the attainment? The three stories have three associated discourses in which some statements make sense that otherwise wouldn't if we attribute them to a different story. Now, I had many questions of various sorts as I was reading through the book, and most of them aren't limited just to Itamar's project, but are relevant to our shared scholarly practices. So here I will ask just three more general questions. First, it wasn't always clear to me how reading Gita philosophically turns out in practice. There are obviously the two central premises of the three story and the latter that are inspired by contemporary scholarship outside or on the outskirts of the Indological. But when all was said and done, it seems to me that we end up with a new hermeneutic frame of reading the Gita rather than engagement with specific philosophical or theological problems. There are interesting parallels with Chinese philosophy that are certainly constructive, and steps towards promoting the guna theory as one that can have a more global application. Yet for me, at least, it does feel like it is interpreting the text of the Gita rather than reading problems through the lens of the Gita or in dialogue with the Gita. Itamar opens the book beautifully with the question, and I quote, "Can the Gita become the source of vibrant and contemporary philosophical engagement, or should it be confined to the study of the history of Indian philosophy?" I'll invite him to say a bit more prospectively, if not retrospectively, as to what sorts of broader philosophical and theological problems the Gita may be engaged for. Second, overarching interpretative models, represented here with the three-story come the ladder structure, do provide a means of understanding a text coherently, but it can also be rough on the edges and possibly suppressive of the semantic potential of texts. Let me illustrate this with a point made in Itamar's 6th chapter. An argument is made there that Dharma and Moksha were the opposite ends, linked by the third story of yoga, i.e. that Dharma is humanistic and unrelated to liberation except for the saving grace of yoga. Yet this led me to thinking that the two have not always been treated as such. In fact, that Svarga is the good associated with Dharma on the one hand and liberation on the other have often been considered two sides of the same coin, under the broader term of the highest good, param shreyasa and shreyasa, and often defined in interchangeable terms. So, see for instance Gita's own verse 3:11, where one is said to attain the highest good by merely upholding the primordial social contract between gods and men. This would be squarely in Itamar's first tier or story, and it wasn't always easy for the commentators to make sense of it. But I think it is precisely illustrative of that sort of semantic potential that global interpretations can suppress. Now my question is it possible or even desirable for schemes of coherent interpretation to remain rough on the edges, to allow and convey more nuance? My third question is a little more complicated and maybe stated in a variety of ways, but it comes down to the role that commentarial literature should play in constructive accounts. Now, Itamar's model of three-story and a ladder is inspired by Wittgenstein through Christian Coseru on the one hand and Keith Ward on the other. To be sure, the model has great affinity with the soteriological model that has permeated traditional interpretations of the Gita, that of paramparya, or progression of practices and attainments, advocated as a model equally by Shankara and Ramanuja through Yamuna, though with great variety of detail. And I think, in fact, that the ladder that Itamar presents as a yoga ladder fits better this paramparya scheme, where practices are in fact given up when a certain attainment, maybe not the final attainment, has been reached. But this isn't the only global traditional model of interpretation. More generally, commentarial literature does not figure prominently in Itamar's book, except for Vishwanatha Chakravartin on one point of interpretation, where certain contemporary accounts, in particular those of R.C. Zehner and Angelika Malinar, are omnipresent. My question then is, most generally, to what extent should traditional scholarship be a participant in contemporary constructive engagements? Should we take a good stock of traditional commentaries before venturing new interpretations? Should commentaries inform our reading of canonical texts as much as, if not more, mainstream scholarship when we seek to advance constructive accounts? Now, these questions are not meant as critique, and I don't think I myself have a clear understanding and answer. I imagine they are pertinent to the methodological choices many of us grapple with. There are the questions that kept presenting themselves as I read through Itamar's excellent book.
Thank you for so great questions, thought-provoking presentations. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Itamar Theodore to come and respond for maybe 12, 14 minutes, and then we can open for discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone. Dear colleagues and friends, I'm really excited to be here. I feel like it's an Oxford Viva, almost, although I don't have the soft mask, not dressed properly. Thank you, DANAM organizers. It's been wonderful to be in DANAM. I really thank you wholeheartedly for this institution. The book is dedicated to Alex Wright, who's sitting here. If you may have noted, it says to Alex Wright, editor and friend, and I mean it. And thank you, Alex, for accepting that.
It's been a great pleasure.
Let me please respond one by one to the points made by my esteemed colleagues. The first feedback both by Jonathan, and you rightly say that my Purvapakshini is Dasgupta, who says that the Gita cannot be taken as coherent philosophy. He's my Purvapakshini. I do adopt a personalistic point of view. And then you ask, how is the Gita different from the other conversational books? So when I bring in the question of personalism, there's one more thing which I do there, and that is I offer a critique of Western logic. Actually, I do it in another book, which also Alex edited, the book of the Bhagavad Purana. There I developed that idea. Basically, that takes me back to Christchurch College, about 2000, sitting with Keith Ward, and trying to understand the foundations of Western thought. And Keith Ward says, why don't you look at Boethius and try to look at Boethius's classical definition of personhood. And we go back to 5th and 6th century CE and speak about Boethius as his individual substance of a rational nature. And he says this is a classical definition of personhood, which is there implicit in Western thought, both Western and Christian thought. And I'm saying, well, this doesn't fit the Gita, because you need a different articulation, a different definition of personhood. And I developed that in that book, in the book with the IBT about the 5th grade of Hinduism. And here I just mentioned briefly, and I said that in order to understand the personalistic view of the Gita, you will have to adopt that. So I actually go as far as offering an alternative to Boethius. It's accepted, but I did that. And I'm saying that you have to understand the term person in a different way. So having done that, I indeed try to fit the different concepts of divinity to my three-story scheme. And I say, first of all, if someone is in the level of Dharma, humanistic level, then they will understand divinity in a certain way. They will see divinity like in Yadai Dharmasya, God comes to establish Dharma, and so forth. And then if one goes further up, then one will be able to understand divinity in terms of Paramatma, and so forth. This will be like 13 chapters and so forth. And then there's some ideas of looking at divinity in the liberated stage. So that's basically the way it goes. I hope it's methodologically accepted, but I do offer an alternative definition of personhood, and through that I say that the personalistic idea is that one transcends these levels one by one and goes up. As far as Nikky, thank you so much for highlighting the point that the Dharma serves as a unitary framework. And then Graham brought this point again. How does it work? That's basically one of my major arguments in this work, is that the Bhagavad-gita is dharmic from beginning and end. However, there are varieties of levels of consciousness by which one performs Dharma. And that's the idea of the ladder. There's Dharma in a utilitarian mode, and then there's Dharma for its own sake. That's Karmani Eva Dikaraste and these famous verses, which is like the access of the Gita. And again, then it goes higher to karma. What is that? Koshalam. What's that? Dharma is out of order. Yoga karma sukoshalam. Sorry, yoga karma sukoshalam. And yeah, to the level of yoga as being the perfection of karma. I do equate karma with Dharma, and that's as I mentioned, and I'm trying to show how what starts as karma yoga later develops into bhakti. And my main argument there is that karma is actually Dharma, and then karma yoga is Dharma yoga. I make that point. That's a major argument. And now I'll answer Graham, because you bring that 1866, this Charma Shloka, and that verse rejects all dharmas. But even after rejecting all dharmas, what does Arjuna do? He performs dharma out of devotion.
So he falls down the ladder.
No. He transcends dharma,
Okay.
but then he sticks to his dharma in the state of unsupported bhakti. So that will be my answer, which will come. That once we arrive at this 1866 famous verse, rejecting all dharmas, still Arjuna would follow his dharma. Would say, I rejected dharma, and so now what? Now let me follow dharma. So from that point of view, the Gita is dharmic from beginning to the end, albeit on various levels of consciousness, but it's always dharmic. There's no point where the Gita rejects dharma. Then Nikki, you mentioned that Clooney's merging philosophy and theology. Thank you for that. And dharma is a type of yoga. I think I think I explained that's a major argument, and thank you for bringing it up. That karma yoga is synonymous with dharma yoga. Okay, so that's this one. Now, there's the question which you raised: is it correct to impose a structure on the Gita? That is a good question. I am a commentator. I'm doing hermeneutics, and I am imposing a structure. I'm not saying that it's in the Gita. It says that there's a three-story house. No, it's my own invention, if you like. Yes, I'm a commentator. I'm free thinking, and actually, Purushottam Bilimoria was part of this. He said after my presentation at the World Sanskrit Conference in Australia, it was online. It wasn't in physical serve. He says, actually, Itamar, you're a modern commentator in yourself. You had Shankara, Ramanuja, all these commentators, and you have your own commentary. I think it's a compliment. I hope it's okay.
There was Shankara. That's good.
But he said, yes, you're paving your own path. Your commentary. I mean, why did Shankara come with his ideas of, this and that, and Ramanuja? So I'm trying. I'm also Klaus Klossenmeier, the late Klaus Klossenmeier. He said, I'm a modern commentator. I'm bringing the Gita a modern type. So that's the way I see it. I think in terms which can appeal to people in the 21st century. I guess if we were now 1,000 years ago, probably the terms would have been different. So yes, I'm imposing a structure of the Gita, and also in my other work on the Gita, I do divide the text into sections, which is also imposing them. I decide that these 10 verses are a section. Why? Because that's the way I read it, and of course there's some limitation in this. Zener also does it. I follow Zener in that. Yeah, and then Nikki, you wrote that verse, Mami Partavya Pashritya. So just to say something about this verse, I always felt bad that Yepisiu Papa Yona, that's Yoga Shudras, that the women and the Vaishyas and the Shudras. So I try to do it differently, that everyone can reach liberation. Those of Papa Yonaya, of sinful source, 1, 2 women, 3 Vaishyas, 4 Shudras. Not that the 3 represent the Papa Yonaya, but there are 4 types. That's commentary trick, or you could say, but that's the way I take it. That there are 4 types. It's not like
Sanskrit could be taken that way too.
yeah, no, it's legitimate.
Yep.
There are 4 types. Not that the 3 types were all sinful, but
That's right.
there are 4 types: sinful and women and Vaishyas and Shudras. That's my feministic touch to my commentary. Stephanie, thank you so much for highlighting the idea of rebirth as the axis for the entire text. I really think so, that to understand the Gita, you have to see the idea of rebirth. It's the axis, the whole text revolves around it. And I do, in that chapter, divide it into 4 sections, looking at samsara from above, and then the ontological aspect, which are beautifully in the Gita, then the transmigration, the process of transmigration, and you brought this Tulsidas Haram Haram, where you chanted Ram Ram and got liberated. Thank you, with It's beautiful. And also the fourth one is a detached yogic view, that how one looks at the lotus flower, just like the lotus, the fifth chapter, how one is looks at the body while he's eating, while he's sleeping, while he's, you can see that it's not him, the body is like a machine, and external to him. And other verses as well. So thank you for bringing it out, bringing this up. There was there's a question of bhakti. Basically, I said that if you read the Gita without rebirth, then bhakti becomes sentimental. And you raise the question, how is that? And I just like to mention that this is ancient bhakti. We're talking now about ancient bhakti. Freedom Hardy called that scholastic bhakti as opposed to medieval bhakti. Medieval bhakti would be much more developed in terms of rasa, but in this intellectual, it was actually intellectual bhakti that would be needed. You need that to give bhakti a sense of a path to liberation. So, Stephanie, and then you conclude that the idea of rebirth is indispensable. Thank you. And non-sectarian work. And you would like to hear how I look at the whole project. Well, that's a big question, what I'm trying to do. I don't know if I should say that because I don't know if you'll kick me out, but I'm trying to articulate the Gita as a global philosophy. That's really what I'm trying to do. I have an article which I sent for publication a few years ago. I'm not sure they ever published that. The Gita as philosophy for the 21st century. That also answers your question at the end, what to do with that whole thing. I actually think that the Gita, for various reasons, can serve as a global philosophy. I remember us bringing back Oxford, maybe Jonathan, you were there, we had a class with the late Joseph O'Connell, and he was speaking about global ethics, and he was saying that as far as global ethics, people look at Dharma as a potential framework for global ethics. It means to unite the globe, the world, under one ethical system which will be accepted for all. And I really think the Gita as a philosophy is potentially good for that. It can unite many cultures and religions and bring in various ideas, Gandhian ideas, that's where we share same ideas, look into ecology, ethics, religion, anti-consumerism, because the Gita furthers anti-consumerism and austerities and so forth. And actually there's a potential here to unite East and West. East, I mean China. That's another, see, I locate the Gita as a center between China and the West. That's nothing. So anyhow, you asked, so I answer. Okay, now Graham. I'm giving a fresh structure. Thank you, supported and unsupported bhakti, karma yoga, dharma yoga, Dharma as the unifying framework. We discussed Bhagavad-gita 1866, we discussed this, and the ladder. One of my main arguments is this ladder. Now, we all know the yoga ladder, the Patanjali yoga ladder, yama niyama. My argument here is that underlying the Gita is a different ladder, not a yoga ladder, but a karma yoga ladder. That's a major argument. Not just it's that in the Gita there is a karma yoga ladder, a ladder of motives, and that's this famous ladder. Or not famous, but that's the ladder I'm trying to highlight. So that's there. Where do you take this idea of hierarchical reality? It's there in Indian thought, in Advaita and Buddhist thought. Although they have it usually with the two levels, earthly, I mean divine and human, and I have three. I have one intermediate, but it's actually a Indian philosophical idea of hierarchical reality. I'm not inventing that. We have Harika and Paramatic and so forth. And then you say, what about dramatic elements? You put it there. So I do, it's a small section, it could have been developed much more. Actually, you develop it in your book, and you speak about Radha, and you develop that. But I did give some place for the dramatic elements in the Gita. I did mention the 11th chapter, and I did mention Norvin Hines' work of ancient dramas in Mathura. Yeah, it's there. I do touch the dramatic elements, and that also refers to the Gita's aesthetics, which were brought here. What about the Gita's aesthetics? So I bring it there, and also I bring the aesthetics in the chapter with Jonathan you read. That chapter, I also refer to the Gita's poetic nature, and I do feel bad that Gita is a song, and I'm pushing it towards philosophy. I'm aware of that, and all I can say that I feel bad about it, but I feel guilty.
You're a good company.
What's that?
You're a good company.
Yeah. So really, I'm pushing the Gita towards philosophy, but actually the Gita is Gita, and you could have read it in a whole poetic way, and there are works about it. And actually, in my second edited volume on the Gita, I have 3 books. This is the third one, but the second was edited, and then we have a Raj Balkaran who speaks about Krishna's epithets in the Gita. From the aesthetic point of view, each name brings a different rasa, emotion, and so forth. So it's there, and I feel bad. My emotion is a feeling bad. But the Gita is a Gita, and I'm pushing it towards philosophy. Maybe one day, I don't know.
That's your next book.
I don't know. Let's see. Now, Alexander. So thank you. This is a new reading of the Gita. Thank you for this, Alexander. I'm trying to read it as a philosophy, and thank you for bringing Ludwig Wittgenstein's Form of Life and the Language Game. That's a great honor. I mean, he was, of course, a Cambridge scholar, and he had Jewish roots. And anyhow, I feel honored that you actually bring Ludwig Wittgenstein, with his Forms of Life and Language Game. You analyze the 3 levels: the humanistic level, and the second story is the discourse of yoga, and I won't repeat what you're saying, but I deeply agree. And the third one, now we speak about the guna, and you say that I actually aim at a theory of everything, and you're right. I actually see the gunas as a theory of everything, that the whole world could be philosophized just in terms of the gunas, and it's just. And then you said that it's first story, and you're right again. And you said it's there's a freshness of thought here that's much appreciated. So thank you very much. I really just say thank you for that. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, and you're reading it. Yeah, and then you ask 3 questions. And let's see what you ask. You ask, can the Gita become a source of vibrant and of contemporary philosophical engagement? So for that purpose, there's another chapter which we didn't refer to. This is chapter 9, the Bhagavad-gita's educational doctrines. And in that chapter, I'm trying to serve an educator, a teacher for that matter, who says, how can I teach the Gita? I mean, not an indulgence, Sankhya and Upanishads and the Karma Yoga, just a normal high school teacher who's trying to teach the Gita. So I try to offer some simplified version of the Gita. I said, this is spirituality, and this is virtue ethics, and this is ecology. That's the 9th chapter, which we didn't refer to here, but it's an attempt. It could be expanded much more, I have to say. But how to teach the Gita for non-indologists, for normal people, kind of normal people. So so you could see it's a philosophical project, which I hope will happen. We'll see. So that's the first question. The second one is about Svarga. Basically, for me, Svarga is first level, not third level.
Yes, but my point is, it has been theorized as having the same status as moksha.
Not
You see it in
my
Bhagavad-gita, but by
I know.
thinkers in that same conceptual universe. So there's this idea of the highest good where Svarga and moksha are competing. So my question is, can we express some ambiguities when we have these overarching.
I see it as first level, even Svaga. That's my own interpretation, but we can discuss that. That's it. And then the last one you ask, can we mingle traditional and modern? Basically, I'm trying to do modern commentaries, but with Vishwanath and his ladder, I'm happy to absorb that, and that for me it strengthened my argument that I'm not the first one. I'm adopting a model which was already there, not so explicit, but also there in the 18th century, Indian Hindu Vaishnava actually, Gaudiya Vaishnava actually thought Vishwanath Chakravarti. So that's the way I do it. I'll take ideas from everywhere, and here I'm finished. So thank you, and back to you, Veena.
So it's like 3 minutes, so maybe people can ask questions and we can answer later together. How do we go about it? So let's take a few questions.
Whatever Veena says.
Can I ask, I can, first of all, I'm enjoying this tremendously, and now I must read the book, absolutely. I've enjoyed your other work, and I absolutely must read it. Am I detecting, is it fair to say, am I detecting some idea of the Maimonidean, let's say, the allegory of the castle, or the, on one hand, in terms of the analogy I'm hearing, and would this relate somehow to the two opinions vis-a-vis Maimonides? Is he Platonic or Aristotelian? Does the philosopher king ultimately give up Dharma? Does he give up studies or not? Could you see any connection to this? Am I seeing?
Can you remind me of the Maimonidean
Oh,
model?
I'm sorry. So there's an so then maybe it's my own. There's the analogy of the castle, where it describes different people some seeing it from the outside, some see it from within the gates, some are able to see it. Each has
basically it's different levels of reality and different people.
and levels. Of,
different levels and different people seeing reality from different points of view, and the whole structure goes up, leads one up and up, but different people are situated in different levels of consciousness.
With this ultimate, now that the deeper you see until once you're able to see the castle, you're seeing the ultimate.
Yeah, and the whole thing is dharmic.
Yes.
You never divorce dharma. You always are dharmic, but from different points of view.
Yeah. So ultimately, in the question with my mind is once you reach the highest level of knowledge, do you continue to keep mitzvot, the commandments, from in a new way, maybe like what you're describing with Dharma, or do you relinquish?
No, you don't relinquish the mitzvot.
Yeah.
That's why we have this book, Dharma and Halacha, in which you compose a chapter.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
So I would recommend everybody can ask questions later. So let's thank the panelists. For DANAM session is closed. So Jonathan,
Yes.
you're supposed to.
Yes, this DANAM is officially, this is our last session. DANAM is officially closed, so thank you very much,
Thank you for coming.
everybody that has attended. If you're new, please sign up at the front desk. We can keep you on our mailing list. And those of you that are attending the dinner tonight, the participants, we look forward to seeing you at 7 p.m., correct?
Five.